Hello, my name is Andy Wheeler, and I'll be discussing the topic of misrepresentation of women in professional sports, which has to do with diversity, the diversity section of our course from Communications and Media and Sport. And so, with the misrepresentation of professional women athletes, it's been a problem for decades. And generally, they're not portrayed in the same positive manner as men are in the media, where men are portrayed as the typical athlete. They're dominant, independent, and very athletic, where women are not portrayed as such. The media has such a powerful way of not only portraying gender stereotypes, but reinforcing them and creating them as norms for the public perception. And the battle for true representation in sports for women really kicked off in 1972 with the passing of Title IX, a part of the Omnibus Education Act of 1972, which created equal federal funding for higher education for both men and women, which really encouraged participation in sports for women, starting at high school and college levels and then in turn going professionally. And overall, women's participation in professional sports and sports in general have been an ongoing battle for decades and stems back to the early 20th century. And it's argued that this represented a genuine effort by women for true equality, self-definition, and control over themselves and their bodies through the participation of sport and being able to participate in sports. And so Lumpkin discusses three main factors as to why women are so grossly misrepresented in professional sports. The first factor being a quantitative misrepresentation. And so there's a 30-year analysis done by the New York Times, I think it was about 5 years ago in 2015, where they looked at newspaper articles that had to do with professional sports dating back to the 1980s. And it found that 86.7% of sports media coverage of professional sports was on men, and only 5.2% covered female professional sports. You can see that as a huge gap where, female participation in professional sports has increased, so much throughout the last few decades, but the coverage still remains very scarce in their favor. And another study showed that less than 10% of all sports coverage includes women's professional sports, and only 2% of that is female sports that are deemed masculine, like professional rugby, for example, like a sport that's not generally viewed as being feminine. And even though women make up 40% of all athletic participants out of high school, college, and professional sports, they only get 4% of the total coverage throughout the nation's media of sports. The next factor that Lumpkin talks about is the reinforcement of this second-class status for women. And it can be reinforced in many ways, and the most common way through sports media is by generally referring to women by their first name and men by their last name. And this is a sociological kind of sign of second-class status by calling someone by their first name and not properly talking about them by their last name or their proper name. And another way that this second-class status is kind of reinforced is through adding women to the sporting league or the sport title. For example, the WNBA, men's basketball, it's not called the MNBA. It's not the Men's National Basketball Association. It's just National Basketball Association. And so adding women to that kind of gives a second-class status of, this is a second-tier league because it's women. And so it gives off a really bad image through sports coverage, naming leagues like that. And also of titling, for example, the Final Four of women's Final Four versus just the normal Final Four. And of course, internationally for the Olympics, they have men's and women's, but just focusing on American leagues, the reinforcement of second-class status comes from adding women to the title of leagues and sports. The third factor that Lumpkin talks about is the media's emphasis on femininity and what it means to be feminine through societal expectations and norms. And so professional female athletes in sports media are not usually portrayed as athletic, independent, and dominant like men are in their respective leagues. They tend to be portrayed as women first and athletes second, with focuses on them being wives, sisters, mothers, and friends. And by perpetuating this typical gender role of women by sports media, it further polarizes women from men, not only in the significance of their sport or their league, but by their gender roles as well. And so one of the theories that was brought up by R.W. Connell in the 1980s for a sociological perspective on why these gender roles in masculinity are enforced through media is hegemonic masculinity. And it suggests that the expected behaviors and social norms are associated with men being the dominant force in culture and society, and that they exert their force over others, and specifically women. It's very apparent in sports as well, where the dominant male culture narrowly focuses on and defines the perception of athleticism and masculinity and what it means to be an athlete. And it's centered around specific traits that coincide with being athletic, such as aggression, toughness, independence, and dominance. And to this day, the media still focuses on that narrow lens to which it portrays sports, or women in professional sports. And so there's a theory, there's also another supporting theory from a sociological standpoint that looks at media as a whole, not just sports media, and how the media kind of shapes society's views and worldview of specific people. And this is called cultivation theory. And this theory suggests that over time, the mass media narrowly focuses on people and events throughout the country and throughout the world and portray them in a very specific way that they want society to kind of view these people or events. And over time, through this mass exposure, people adopt these views and they truly take it in as truth. And it really shapes their view of the world and how the world works. And so this theory can be applied to how perceptions of women over time have been seen as, second-class citizens and what it means to be feminine. And that's seen throughout just normal mass media throughout history, but also sports media. And through, over time, with this perception of what women are and what they're supposed to be in society, especially through sports media, is shown that they're not dominant, they're not the independent, athletic, dominant, person that professional male athletes are. I think it's very dangerous to have this portrayal over time, but from a sociological standpoint, it can be argued that this is not done intentionally. It's just how we've inherited the world and the norms of the world that we come into. We inherit those views of, women and what it means to be feminine and take those on with us throughout the rest of our lives. And you can see that through sports media to this day. So there are some possible solutions, I believe, to combat this gross misrepresentation of women in professional sports. First of which is just to create a dialogue. And so what sports journalists could do is, on a local level, they could open a dialogue with local professional female athletes and talk about these issues and get their perspective on how it's affecting them, how they see the issue. And, you really can't come up with solutions until you discuss people who are being affected by it and look through their lens. I think another way to combat these issues is to proactively cover women's sports more, whether it's locally, high school or college, and in turn professional, but just getting more coverage on these sports could definitely change the perception as well. And the last solution, I think, is the most important, is just to educate oneself on the sociological history and implications of gender roles and expectations over time. You can't create any change or talk about change if you're not aware of the situation and aware of how we got to where we are right now. So you have to educate yourself on the media perception of women throughout history and in turn sports media, and then a real dialogue can come out of that. So overall, as a result of the misrepresentation of professional women athletes, women can be further portrayed as second-class citizens and portrayed as, what it means to be feminine compared to men. And that this masculinity in sports has been perpetuated through the lens of sports throughout history, and specifically the last century. But I think that there is hope for change, and change can definitely happen with the representation of professional women athletes through sports media, by educating oneself on the history of the sociological implications of women through media, along with opening a dialogue with professional women athletes as a sports journalist to kind of become aware and create a dialogue of change. And I think that taking these steps and talking about it, I think that sports journalists, starting at an individual level in working up can truly create a positive change in the representation of women in professional sports.